A family vanished without a trace in 1962, leaving behind nothing but whispers and speculation. Their sudden disappearance became the most baffling mystery of the decade, with investigators completely stumped by the lack of evidence. The shocking truth would remain buried for 3 decades, concealed beneath layers of deception that nobody could have imagined. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. On a rainy July night in 1962, the Carter family vanished without a trace from their modest 2-story home in suburban Chicago. The thunderstorm that evening had kept most neighbors indoors, their windows shut tight against the downpour that drummed relentlessly on rooftops and flooded gutters throughout Oakwood Heights. By morning, when the skies had cleared and the world seemed washed clean, something was terribly wrong at number 17 Maple Street. The Carter residence stood silent, curtains drawn, and the family station wagon still parked in the driveway. Mrs. Abernathy from next door was the first to notice something amiss. She'd brought over a pie as a thank you for Mr. Carter fixing her leaky faucet the previous weekend. When repeated knocks went unanswered, she peered through the kitchen window and saw a truly unsettling sight. 4 plates of eggs and toast sitting untouched on the breakfast table, coffee cups still full, chairs pushed back as if the family had simply stood up mid-meal and walked away. The police were called immediately. Detective Samuel Brooks arrived by mid-afternoon, his weathered face betraying little emotion as he surveyed the scene. At 47, Brooks had investigated everything from petty theft to gruesome homicides. But something about this case made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end the moment he crossed the threshold. "Anything forced?" he asked the uniformed officer who'd responded to the initial call. "No, sir, door was locked when we arrived. Mrs. Abernathy had a spare key they'd given her for emergencies." Brooks moved methodically through the house, noting details with practiced precision. The living room was immaculate, family photos arranged perfectly on the mantel, showing John and Margaret Carter with their 2 children, Emma, age 12, and Thomas, 9. A half-finished knitting project sat beside Margaret's favorite chair. John's pipe rested in an ashtray, still containing ashes from what must have been his last smoke. What troubled Brooks most wasn't what he found. It was what he didn't find. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture, no blood, no hastily scribbled note explaining an emergency departure. The family's suitcases remained in the attic. Their toothbrushes still stood in the bathroom cup. Even the family dog, a golden retriever named Rusty according to the neighbors, had disappeared along with them. As Brooks stood in the center of the living room, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the home's temperature. In 23 years of police work, he'd never encountered a scene quite like this. A family of 4 who seemed to have simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind the shell of their lives. The whispers began almost immediately after the Carters' disappearance. In a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business, their sudden vanishing became the subject of endless speculation. Mrs. Peterson from across the street insisted they had fled to Canada to escape mounting gambling debts. "I always saw strange men in suits visiting late at night," she told anyone who would listen, though no one could recall seeing such visitors themselves. The butcher claimed that John Carter had mentioned something about starting fresh just days before they disappeared. Within weeks, the stories grew wilder. Everything from witness protection to alien abduction theories circulated among the more imaginative residents. Samuel found himself increasingly frustrated by these baseless rumors. A methodical man by nature, he began creating a detailed timeline of the Carters' last known movements. He interviewed the mailman who had delivered their final letters, the grocer who had sold them milk the day before they vanished, and even tracked down John Carter's drinking buddies from the local pub. Each conversation added small details, but no substantial leads. The family's bank accounts remained untouched, their car was still parked in the garage, even their toothbrushes remained in the bathroom cup. Most disturbing to Samuel was his interview with 10-year-old Tommy Wilson, who lived next door. The boy claimed he'd been awakened by strange noises from the Carters' house around 2 in the morning on the night they disappeared. "It sounded like furniture being moved," Tommy had said, his eyes wide. "And then a car I didn't recognize pulled up with its lights off." When Samuel pressed for more details, the boy's mother quickly ended the conversation, saying Tommy had an overactive imagination. But something in the woman's nervous manner suggested she might be hiding something herself. The deeper Samuel dug, the more he felt that the truth about the Carters was buried beneath layers of secrets that the entire neighborhood seemed determined to keep hidden. What had this ordinary family done or seen that had led to their complete erasure from existence? The investigation into the Bakers' disappearance gradually lost momentum as days stretched into weeks. Newspapers relegated the story to smaller columns, and the police chief began assigning his officers to other cases. But Detective Samuel Cooper couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every night he would return home, spread the case files across his dining table, and stare at the photographs until his eyes burned with fatigue. "There's something I'm not seeing," he would mutter to himself, pouring another cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Against department protocol, Samuel began visiting the Baker house after hours. He told himself it was professional thoroughness, but deep down he knew it was becoming an obsession. The empty rooms seemed to whisper secrets he couldn't quite hear. On his 4th unauthorized visit, while standing in 15-year-old Emily Baker's bedroom, something caught his eye, a slight unevenness in the wooden floorboards near her closet. Getting down on his hands and knees, Samuel pressed against the boards until one gave way with a soft creak. His heart raced as his fingers touched something solid in the small cavity below. Carefully, he extracted a metal box, about the size of a thick paperback book. It was locked, with no key in sight, and surprisingly heavy for its size. Samuel turned it over in his hands, noting the lack of dust, unlike everything else in the house. This hadn't been sitting there for weeks. It had been deliberately placed there much more recently. As he shook it gently, something inside shifted with a metallic clink. Samuel slipped the box into his jacket pocket, glancing nervously at the darkened windows. Whatever secrets the Baker family had been keeping, he suspected this box might hold the answers, or at least the beginning of them. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The box's contents spilled onto Samuel's kitchen table. Yellowed photographs with curled edges and what appeared to be a handwritten letter on paper so delicate it threatened to crumble at his touch. He handled each photograph carefully, studying the faded images. The Carters at what looked like a picnic, another showing them standing beside an old sedan, and several of the children playing near water. Samuel squinted at this last image, noticing something written on the back in faint pencil. "Last day at Hawthorne Lake, July 1962. The letter was even more intriguing, written in handwriting that trembled across the page as if the author had been terrified or ill. "If you're reading this, I'm probably gone too," it began. "Hawthorne Lake holds answers, but be careful. Some secrets are too dangerous to share, even with those you trust most." The signature at the bottom was smudged beyond recognition, but Samuel was certain it wasn't from any of the Carters he knew about. Samuel spent the next 3 days searching for any mention of Hawthorne Lake in county records. The name appeared in no official maps from the period, and when he called the Regional Historical Society, the elderly volunteer seemed oddly hesitant. "That place hasn't been called Hawthorne Lake since the 50s, she finally admitted. "It's Crescent Reservoir now. Has been since the Army Corps of Engineers project in '63. When Samuel pressed for more information about the Carters' connection to the area, he hit wall after wall. Property records showed no ownership under their name, and newspaper archives from the period made no mention of them visiting or living near the lake. Yet the photographs clearly placed them there just before their disappearance. One evening, frustrated by his lack of progress, Samuel found himself staring at the photographs again. Something about the background of one image caught his attention, a partial view of what appeared to be a large stone building behind the trees. It wasn't a typical vacation cabin. The structure looked institutional, almost like a hospital or research facility. Samuel felt a chill run through him as he realized the mystery was far deeper than a simple family disappearance. Whatever happened at Hawthorne Lake in the summer of 1962 had been deliberately obscured, and someone had gone to great lengths to erase not just the Carter family, but perhaps the very place itself from public record. In 1963, a glimmer of hope emerged when a lone hiker reported hearing distant, chilling screams echoing through the dense forest surrounding Hawthorne Lake. The man, visibly shaken, insisted to authorities that the sounds were unmistakably human, desperate cries that had stopped him dead in his tracks on an otherwise peaceful spring morning. A search party was hastily assembled, combing the rugged terrain for 3 days straight, but not a single piece of evidence materialized. No footprints, no torn clothing, no signs of disturbance in the wilderness that might connect to the missing Carter family. The lake's murky waters were partially dragged, revealing nothing but silt and forgotten fishing gear. The hiker's testimony, once considered a promising lead, was eventually dismissed as either an animal encounter or the wind playing tricks through the canyon's natural acoustics. Detective Samuel Wilson refused to let go so easily. He returned to Hawthorne Lake alone 6 times over the next month, sitting in silence for hours, hoping to hear what the hiker had described. But the forest kept its secrets, and the Carter file grew thicker with dead ends and speculation. By Christmas of 1963, the case had grown ice cold. Local newspapers stopped running updates, and the community's collective attention drifted to other matters. The family photographs that had once been plastered across town slowly disappeared from shop windows and community boards, replaced by advertisements and notices of happier occasions. The Carters were becoming ghosts, not just physically absent, but fading from public consciousness. Samuel's obsession with the case took its toll. His marriage suffered, his health declined, and in 1967, he reluctantly accepted early retirement. At his modest farewell gathering, he made his colleagues promise they would never officially close the Carter file. Something happened to them, he insisted, eyes rimmed red from years of sleepless nights. People don't just vanish into thin air, but in many ways, that's exactly what the Carters had done. Their home had long since been sold, their possessions auctioned off, their dog adopted by a family 3 counties over. Within a decade, the Carter disappearance had transformed from a tragic mystery into something of an urban legend, a cautionary tale parents told teenagers about the dangers lurking beyond the town limits. Their faces, once so familiar to everyone in the community, now existed primarily in faded newspaper clippings stored in the town library's archives, waiting for the truth that seemed destined never to come. The drought of 1992 hit Lakeside County with merciless intensity. By August, Hawthorne Lake had receded nearly 30 feet from its normal shoreline, exposing mudflats that hadn't seen daylight in decades. 2 local fishermen, Mike Donovan and his teenage son, were trudging across the cracked, grey mud one Sunday morning when something glinted in the weak sunlight. Mike initially thought it was just another beer can, but as he bent down to investigate, his breath caught in his throat. It was a small, heart-shaped locket, its silver surface dulled by years underwater but still intact. Just a few feet away, partially embedded in the hardening mud, was what appeared to be a child's leather shoe, remarkably preserved by the lake's cold, oxygen-poor depths. "Dad, should we call someone?" his son had asked, sensing the gravity of their discovery. Mike nodded silently, unable to shake the feeling that they'd stumbled upon something significant. By nightfall, the local sheriff had cordoned off the area, and by the following morning, state police investigators had arrived. The drought that had devastated local farmers had inadvertently provided law enforcement with an unexpected opportunity. Detective Sarah Morales, who'd grown up hearing stories about the vanished Henderson family, felt a chill when she first saw the locket. Opening it revealed a faded photograph of a smiling woman with 2 children, faces that matched the 30-year-old missing persons reports. What began as a curious discovery quickly escalated into a full-scale forensic operation. Teams of investigators, equipped with metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, methodically searched the exposed lake bed. 3 days into the search, a technician's equipment registered something large and metallic buried beneath 2 feet of silt. Careful excavation revealed the first of 3 suitcases, rusted but intact, secured with heavy chains and padlocks. Each was roughly the same size, large enough to hold personal belongings, but not much else. Then, 20 yards farther out, in what would have been deeper water, they found something that made even the most seasoned investigators pause: a 4th container, much larger than the others, similarly chained and weighted down with concrete blocks. As forensic technicians carefully documented the scene, Detective Morales couldn't help but think of the 4 missing Henderson family members and the 4 containers now emerging from their watery grave after 30 years of silence. The media circus descended on Lake Mercer with the ferocity of vultures. By sunrise, news vans lined the shore, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking light. Reporters trampled the muddy banks, jostling for position, their microphones thrust forward as if they were weapons. "We're standing at what might be the epicenter of the most bizarre cold case in decades," one broadcaster announced, her hair whipping in the wind as cameras rolled. The discovery had transformed this sleepy town into the nation's most watched location overnight. Sheriff Dawson established a perimeter, but it did little to contain the frenzy. Photographers with telephoto lenses captured blurry images of evidence bags being carried from the water's edge. Inside those bags, the artifacts of the Carter family's final days told a story more complex than anyone had imagined. There were family snapshots, James Carter grinning beside a Christmas tree, Sarah holding baby Thomas on her hip while Emily clutched a new doll. The most disturbing detail, the photos were dated 3 weeks after the family had supposedly vanished without a trace. Children's toys pulled from the suitcases carried whispers of interrupted lives, a wooden train with Tommy painted on its side, a half-finished coloring book with Emily's name carefully written in crayon on the inside cover. Letters addressed to relatives bore postmarks from February 1963, containing cheerful updates about new opportunities and promises to visit soon. But it was the trunk that caused veteran detectives to exchange troubled glances. Inside lay 5 passports, each bearing the photos of Carter family members, but with different surnames: Williams, Peterson, Thompson. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a family that had disappeared. This was a family that had planned to become someone else. The question that hung in the air like a storm cloud was no longer just what had happened to them, but who, exactly, the Carters really were. The fingerprint analysis finally confirmed what investigators had suspected. The personal items recovered from the storage unit did indeed belong to the Carter family. The technician's report landed on the new lead detective's desk with a soft thud that belied its significance. Detective Lisa Hernandez, recently transferred from the cold case unit, studied the findings with intense focus. 30 years had passed since the Carters vanished, yet here was tangible proof they hadn't simply disappeared into thin air. They had methodically planned their exit, so they deliberately changed their identities, Lisa murmured to herself, spreading the evidence photos across her desk. But why would an ordinary family, with no criminal records, no debts, and no known enemies go to such lengths to disappear? She picked up a faded photograph of the Carters, John, Martha, and their 3 children, smiling at a backyard barbecue just weeks before they vanished. Their expressions betrayed nothing of what was to come. The storage unit contained a peculiar collection: birth certificates, family photos, school records, and even John's military service medals, everything that defined who they were. Lisa found it particularly strange that they'd kept these items rather than destroying them. It was as if they couldn't fully let go of their past lives, despite needing to create new ones. The detective turned her attention to a small wooden box containing dozens of handwritten letters. Unlike the other items, these weren't family mementos, but correspondence between John Carter and someone identified only as M.K. For the next 3 days, Lisa barely left her desk, methodically reading each letter, arranging them chronologically, and searching for patterns. The letters spanned nearly 2 years before the family's disappearance, growing increasingly urgent and cryptic over time. They were afraid of something, or someone, Lisa told her partner. Though these aren't the actions of people running towards something better, they were running away from something they feared more than losing their entire identities. One letter particularly stood out. Dated just 2 weeks before the Carters vanished, it contained a newspaper clipping about a government official's promotion and 3 words scrawled in John's handwriting: "He found us." Lisa stared at those words for a long time, feeling the first real breakthrough in 3 decades beginning to take shape. Whatever the Carters had been running from in 1962, it had finally caught up with them. And now, perhaps, she could finally uncover what it was. One letter stood out from the pile, its pages yellowed with age, the handwriting frantic and uneven. It was from Margaret Carter, dated just 2 weeks before the family's disappearance. As Detective Reynolds unfolded it, his stomach tightened. "Someone has been watching us," Margaret had written to her sister. "For months now. At first it was just a feeling, but then the notes started appearing on our doorstep. 'I see you,' one said. 'I know what you did,' said another." Reynolds felt a chill as he continued reading. Margaret described late-night phone calls where the person on the other end would just breathe heavily before hanging up. The letter grew more disturbing as Margaret detailed a shadowy figure she'd spotted multiple times. "I see him standing at the edge of our property, always just beyond the streetlight's reach. When I blink or look away, he vanishes. James thinks I'm being hysterical, says it's just neighborhood kids playing pranks, but I know better. This isn't random. This person knows our routines, knows when James works late, knows when the children are alone with me." The fear in Margaret's words was almost tangible. Reynolds could practically feel her terror leaping off the page. "Sometimes I wake up at night," she wrote, "certain someone is standing outside our bedroom window. Last Tuesday I found muddy footprints circling our house, every window, every door. The police came, but said there wasn't enough evidence to investigate properly." Her final lines were the most chilling. "I don't think we have much time left. Something terrible is coming. If anything happens to us, please tell the authorities to look for the man with the scarred left hand. I've seen it when he leaves the notes." Reynolds set the letter down, his hands trembling slightly. This wasn't just a family that decided to start over somewhere new. They had been targeted, hunted, and whatever happened to them, Margaret had sensed it coming. He picked up the phone to call his partner. The case had just taken a sinister turn, and those muddy footprints from 30 years ago might finally lead somewhere. Lisa meticulously traced through the phone records from 1962, a tedious process that required calling in favors from former colleagues at the police department. What she discovered sent chills down her spine. Several calls had been made from a payphone located just 3 blocks from the Carters' home in the weeks before their disappearance. All of these calls were to numbers that had since been disconnected, leaving no trail to follow. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Someone had been making calls from that specific location, perhaps watching the family's movements. But these calls were made between midnight and 2 in the morning, Lisa told Michael as they sat in her cramped office. Who makes calls at that hour unless they're trying to hide something? The payphone had been removed decades ago, but Lisa managed to track down records showing the company that had operated it. After several dead ends, she finally located the maintenance records and, through them, the names of people who had serviced that particular booth. Most had passed away, but one name stood out: Harold Jenkins, now 87 and residing at Sunny Pines nursing home just outside the city. When Lisa and Michael visited the nursing home the following day, they found Harold alert despite his advanced age. His eyes lit up at the mention of the old payphone. "Oh, I remember that one," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "Had to service it more than any other in my route. People were always vandalizing it." When Lisa mentioned 1962, Harold's expression changed. There was something odd that summer. For weeks, I'd see the same car parked near that booth when I'd come to empty the coin box or fix the line. "What kind of car?" Michael asked, leaning forward. "A black Cadillac, fairly new at the time, dark windows. I noticed because it seemed out of place in that neighborhood. Too fancy." Harold paused, his roomy eyes focusing on a distant memory. "The strange thing was, whenever I approached to service the booth, the car would drive away, only to return after I left. Happened at least 4 or 5 times." Lisa felt her pulse quicken. "Did you ever see who was driving?" Harold shook his head slowly. "Never got a good look, but I remember thinking it was odd. Who sits in a car watching a payphone? I mentioned it to my supervisor once, but he just told me to mind my own business." The investigation languished for years until 1991, when a frail woman in her 70s walked into the sheriff's office, her hands trembling as she asked to speak with someone about the Carter case. Eleanor Winters had been the Carters' next-door neighbor in 1962, a young mother who had watched the family through her kitchen window while washing dishes each evening. "I've carried this burden for too long," she told Detective Ramirez, her voice barely above a whisper. What she revealed that afternoon sent shockwaves through the investigation team. On the night the Carters vanished, Eleanor had been up late with her colicky infant. Around 2 in the morning, she'd noticed unusual activity at the Carter home, specifically 2 men she didn't recognize moving between the garage and a van parked on the street. They were dragging something, Eleanor recounted, tears welling in her eyes, heavy bags, like the kind you'd use for soil or concrete. They made 3 trips from the garage to the van. I knew something wasn't right. When Ramirez asked why she hadn't come forward sooner, Eleanor's face crumpled. The men had looked directly at her window at one point, and she ducked behind her curtains, terrified. The next day, when she heard the Carters were missing, she connected the dots but was paralyzed by fear. "They knew where I lived. I had a baby, a husband who worked nights. I convinced myself it wasn't what I thought." For 3 decades, Eleanor had battled nightmares and guilt. She'd moved away from the neighborhood within months of the incident, but never escaped the memory. Now widowed and diagnosed with terminal cancer, she felt compelled to unburden herself before it was too late. "I can still describe them," she said, providing details about the men's appearances that matched no one in the original case files. One had a distinctive scar across his cheek, the other walked with a noticeable limp. The van, she recalled, was dark-colored with no markings or windows in the back. Most crucially, Eleanor remembered partial numbers from the license plate. This new testimony electrified the cold case unit. Within days, they were cross-referencing Eleanor's description with criminal records from the early 1960s. The timing of her revelation proved fortuitous. Computerized databases had just become sophisticated enough to search historical records efficiently. Detective Ramirez couldn't help but wonder, if Eleanor had spoken up in 1962, would the Carters' fate have been discovered decades earlier? And who were these mysterious men who had haunted an elderly woman's conscience for 30 years? The answers, as they would soon discover, were more disturbing than anyone had imagined. As Lisa arranged her notes across the motel room bed, a clearer picture began to emerge. The Carters hadn't simply vanished into thin air as everyone had believed for 3 decades. They had been taken, methodically, precisely by someone who had studied their routines and habits, someone who knew exactly when they would be most vulnerable. They were targeted, she whispered to herself, pinning a photo of the family to her makeshift timeline. The neighbor's testimony about the strange car parked down the street for 3 days before the disappearance. The mailman's recollection of a man in overalls who didn't belong in the neighborhood. The school secretary mentioning that someone had called to verify when the Carter children would be dismissed early that Friday. All these details pointed to surveillance, careful planning. Lisa reached for her coffee, now cold from sitting untouched for hours. The deeper question gnawed at her. Who would orchestrate such an elaborate abduction of an entire family? And why keep it hidden for 30 years? Ordinary kidnappings involved ransom demands, but no one had ever contacted the extended family for money. This was something else entirely. The answer, she realized, might be buried in James Carter's past, before settling into suburban life. He had worked for a government contractor with military connections. His employment records showed a 6-month gap that nobody could explain. His closest friend from those days had died in a car accident just weeks before the family disappeared. Lisa pulled out the yellowed newspaper clippings she'd collected. One headline caught her eye: "Defense project scrapped after budget concerns." The article, dated just 3 months before the Carters vanished, mentioned unnamed whistleblowers. She hadn't paid much attention to it before, but now... What if he knew something? She muttered, circling the date on her timeline. What if James Carter wasn't just an ordinary engineer? She reached for the phone to call her editor. This story was bigger than a mysterious disappearance. The Carters hadn't been running from debt or family troubles as local gossip had suggested for decades. They had been silenced. And somewhere in James Carter's past lay the reason why someone had decided an entire family needed to disappear without a trace. Digging through dusty employment records at the county archives, Lisa found herself squinting at a yellow document that made her heart skip a beat. There it was, in black and white. James Wilson, the father of the missing family, had worked as an accountant for the Moretti crime family from 1957 to 1961. The Morettis weren't just any criminals. They were one of Chicago's most feared crime syndicates during that era, with tentacles reaching into everything from illegal gambling to union racketeering. "Oh, my God," she whispered, her fingers trembling as she traced the employment dates. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Just 11 months before the family's disappearance, James had done something extraordinarily brave, or foolish, depending on one's perspective. Court records showed he had turned state's witness, testifying against 7 high-ranking members of the Moretti organization in a high-profile racketeering case. His testimony had been devastating, providing detailed financial records that traced money laundering operations across 3 states. Detective Reynolds leaned over her shoulder, his coffee breath warm against her ear. "Well, I'll be damned." Our quiet suburban accountant had some serious skeletons in his closet. 6 of the mobsters James testified against received sentences ranging from 12 to 20 years. The 7th, underboss Vincent Moretti, got a life sentence without parole. Newspaper clippings from the trial showed James being escorted from the courthouse with his face partially covered. But the damage was done. His identity was known to the organization. "They were supposed to be in witness protection," Lisa said, shuffling through more papers, "but there's no record of them ever entering the program officially." Reynolds nodded grimly. Back then, witness protection was still in its infancy. Procedures were sloppy, underfunded, people fell through the cracks. The pieces were finally coming together. The family hadn't just vanished, they'd been running. The hasty departure, the abandoned possessions, The lack of goodbyes to neighbors or extended family, it all pointed to people fleeing for their lives. But if they'd been in hiding, what had happened to expose them? And more importantly, had they been found by those seeking revenge, or had they simply disappeared into new identities somewhere far away? Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. After 30 years, she'd finally uncovered the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The Wilson family hadn't disappeared because they wanted to. They disappeared because they had to. The family had vanished into the labyrinth of the Federal Witness Protection Program, their old identities stripped away like dead skin. For almost 3 decades, they had lived as the Wilsons, not the Morgans, moving from Seattle to Denver to finally Chicago, always looking over their shoulders, always wondering if today would be the day their past caught up with them. Robert had testified against one of the most dangerous crime syndicates on the East Coast, men who never forgot and never forgave. The children had grown up with coded warnings instead of bedtime stories. If Daddy ever says the phrase, "Time to visit Grandma," we leave immediately. No questions, no delays. Chicago had felt safe for almost 5 years, long enough for them to develop routines, make casual friends, even join a bowling league. But then Robert noticed the same car parked across from his insurance office 3 days in a row. Later that week, someone called their home phone and hung up when Margaret answered. Small things, perhaps coincidences, but Robert knew better. Somehow, they had been found. The suitcases and trunk discovered at Hawthorne Lake 30 years later were part of their emergency contingency plan. A cache of essentials, cash, and new documentation that would allow them to disappear again if necessary. Each family member had memorized the coordinates, the contents, the procedure. If we're ever separated, Robert had drilled into them, make your way to the cache. Wait 3 days. If the others don't arrive, use the documents in the blue envelope and start over. But something had gone catastrophically wrong that autumn night in 1962. Investigators would later piece together that the family had received a warning call from their federal handler at 9:15 p.m. By 9:30, they had fled their modest bungalow, leaving dinner half-eaten on the kitchen table. They never made it to Hawthorne Lake. Their car was found abandoned 20 miles east, its doors open, a child's teddy bear on the back seat, and no signs of struggle. The cache at the lake remained untouched, waiting for family members who would never arrive to claim it. The syndicate's enforcers had intercepted them on a lonely stretch of country road, using information leaked from within the very program designed to protect them. What happened in those final moments would remain a mystery, one of the many questions left unanswered, even after the truth about their disappearance finally emerged 3 decades later. The evidence painted a grim picture of the Carter family's final night. Tire marks near their home suggested a hasty departure, while scattered personal items along the route indicated they'd packed in a hurry. They had clearly been attempting to flee, but something or someone had intercepted them before they could reach their destination. Lisa's investigation revealed they had arranged to meet a contact at a small airfield 50 miles outside of town, but they never arrived. They knew they were in danger, Detective Harrison remarked. Reviewing Lisa's findings, the question is, how did the syndicate find out they were leaving? The men in the van, based on partial descriptions from neighbors who'd spotted the vehicle that night, matched known associates of the Gambrel syndicate. They weren't high-ranking members, but hired muscle, expendable men tasked with sending a message to anyone who might consider testifying against the organization. The timing couldn't have been coincidental. Someone had tipped them off about the Carters' escape plan. Lisa found herself wondering if any of the family members had somehow survived. It wasn't unheard of for witnesses to disappear into new lives with new identities. Perhaps the children, at least, had been spared. The thought gave her a flicker of hope amid the darkness of this case. She obtained special clearance to search through Witness Protection Program records from that era, looking for any pattern that might suggest relocated Carters. For 3 days, she pored over dusty files in a secure government facility, searching for families of 5 relocated in 1962 or 63, particularly those with children matching the ages of the Carter kids. Nothing, she told Harrison, disappointment evident in her voice. If they survived, they didn't do it through official channels. Harrison nodded solemnly. The syndicate was thorough. They wouldn't have left loose ends. The more Lisa uncovered about the Gambrel organization's operations during that period, the more she understood their ruthlessness. They had infiltrated local law enforcement, judicial offices, and even had contacts in federal agencies. Their reach had been extensive, their vengeance absolute. These weren't just criminals, the retired officer who'd worked the original case told her. They were businessmen who treated murder like accounting, just another cost of doing business. A faded photograph changed everything. The yellowed image showed a teenage girl with unmistakable features, the same high cheekbones, distinctive eyebrow arch, and slight dimple on her left cheek that matched every known picture of Emily Carter. But this photo was dated 1970, 8 years after the family's disappearance, and placed her at a small high school in rural Montana. The girl in the photo was identified as Jane Wilson, but there was no mistaking Emily Carter's face. Lisa's hands trembled as she held the photograph. After decades of dead ends, this was the first tangible evidence that at least one Carter family member had survived whatever happened in 1962. Lisa didn't hesitate. She packed a small bag, booked the first available flight, and drove 5 hours from the nearest airport to reach the tiny town of Pinewood, Montana, population 843. The town looked frozen in time, with a single main street lined with weathered storefronts and pickup trucks parked at angles along the curb. Lisa checked into the only motel, a 7-room establishment with wood-paneled walls and bedspreads that hadn't been updated since the 70s. At the local diner the next morning, Lisa showed the photograph to anyone who would look. Most shook their heads. But Marge, a waitress in her 70s who'd worked there since she was 16, stopped mid-pour when she saw the image. "That's Jane Wilson," she said, setting down the coffee pot. "Quiet girl, smart as a whip. Her family lived out on the old Brenner property for about 3 years. Do you remember the family?" Lisa asked, trying to contain her excitement. "Sure do. Kept to themselves mostly. Father worked odd jobs. Mother did some seamstress work. Had 2 younger kids too, a boy and a girl." The description matched the Carter family perfectly. Then one night, they just up and vanished, left everything behind. Some folks said they owed money, others said they were running from something. Never did find out the truth. Lisa spent the next 3 days interviewing elderly residents who remembered the Wilson family. Each account confirmed they had arrived suddenly around 1969, lived quietly for about 3 years, then disappeared overnight without saying goodbye to anyone. The description of the family members matched the Carters in every detail, down to Robert's limp from an old football injury and Margaret's habit of humming while she worked. I knocked on the door of a small bungalow on the outskirts of Phoenix. The man who answered was in his 70s, with a weathered face that had seen more than its share of trouble. He wasn't surprised to see me. "Well, you must be the reporter," he said, not extending his hand. "I figured someone would connect the dots eventually." Former U.S. Marshal Raymond Dawson invited me in reluctantly. His living room was sparse but neat, with framed photos of landscapes, but none of people. After some hesitation, he confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. "Yes, I handled the Carter case in '62, he admitted, pouring himself a whiskey. "It wasn't standard procedure. But nothing about that situation was standard." Dawson revealed that after the failed abduction attempt, the threat assessment had been deemed critical. These weren't ordinary criminals, he explained. They had connections in law enforcement, in government. The family couldn't just move to another state and change their names. What he told me next made my stomach sink. The Carters had been completely separated from each other, husband from wife, parents from children. No! It was the only way to ensure their safety, Dawson insisted, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. Each was given an entirely new identity, background story, even altered appearance in some cases. The most devastating detail was that the separation was permanent. They never saw each other again, Dawson confirmed. Not once in 30 years. It was the condition of the protection. Contact would have endangered them all. I thought about James Carter, living out his days as someone else, perhaps starting a new family but always wondering about his first one. About Margaret, raising their youngest child alone under a different name, in another state. About the older children, told only that they could never speak of their past or try to find their siblings. Did they agree to this? I asked. Dawson's face hardened. They understood the alternative. But no, I wouldn't say they agreed. Who could? They were told it was temporary at first. By the time they realized it wasn't, he trailed off, looking out the window. The youngest one, Emily, she grew up not even knowing her real name or that she had siblings out there somewhere. The others at least had their memories. I wondered how many times each of them had passed strangers on the street, scanning faces, wondering if they'd just walked by their own flesh and blood. Decades of birthdays, holidays, and milestones, all spent apart, each of them incomplete, living half-lives under borrowed names. The Florida sun cast long shadows across the porch as Lisa sat across from the elderly man. His weathered face showed the weight of decades of secrets, and his hands trembled as he placed his glass of iced tea on the table between them. This was Harold Carter, now living as Henry Collins, the last surviving member of the family that had vanished without a trace in 1962. "We were told never to contact each other again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not our parents, not my sisters, nobody. They said if we tried, they'd know, and everyone would be in danger." His eyes darted nervously to the street, a habit formed over 30 years of looking over his shoulder. Lisa noticed how he positioned himself away from the windows, how his gaze constantly swept the surroundings. "The night it happened," he continued, "I was 17. Dad woke us up around 2 in the morning. Men in suits were in our living room. One of them had a folder with photographs, pictures of Dad with people I didn't recognize. They said we had 20 minutes to pack one bag each." Harold's voice cracked. Mom was crying silently, trying not to scare my younger sisters. Lisa leaned forward, careful not to push too hard. "And then what happened? They split us up immediately. Different cars, different directions. I was taken to Texas first, then Oklahoma, then eventually given new papers, a new birthday, a new life story to memorize." He rubbed his wedding band absently. "My wife of 28 years doesn't even know my real name." The weight of his confession hung in the air between them. 3 decades of separation, of wondering, of fabricated histories. The syndicate had people everywhere. Police, government, banks. Dad had seen something he shouldn't have. Documented something that implicated powerful people. Harold's eyes welled with tears. "I tried looking for them once, in 1975. 2 days later, I found a photograph of my new house on my kitchen table. Nobody had broken in. That was their way of saying they were still watching." Lisa felt a chill despite the Florida heat. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was something far more sinister, reaching into the highest levels of power, spanning decades of silence and fear. The truth was more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The Martins hadn't simply vanished. They had been systematically erased by the very system meant to protect them. As Detective Wilson pieced together the final fragments of evidence from dusty archives and reluctant testimonies, the horrifying reality emerged. The family had unwittingly stumbled upon a drug trafficking operation involving 3 high-ranking police officers and a judge in their small town. Their innocent observation at the harbor that summer evening in 1962 had signed their death warrant. They were given a choice that wasn't really a choice at all, Wilson explained, his voice hollow. Disappear completely or be eliminated. The criminal network had tentacles reaching into every level of local law enforcement. The family had been approached by Agent Thomas, now identified as the mastermind behind their disappearance, who convinced them that their only chance of survival was to accept new identities through an unofficial witness protection arrangement. What the Martins didn't know was that this protection was designed to silence them permanently. The children had been deliberately separated from their parents. Little Sarah sent to a family in Oregon, young James to relatives in Michigan. Their parents, Elizabeth and Robert, were transported to different states entirely. Each was told the others had been killed in a tragic accident to prevent them from ever searching for one another. The fabricated newspaper articles about their disappearance had been planted to create a mystery that would eventually go cold. Most heartbreaking was discovering that Elizabeth had spent 17 years searching for her children before succumbing to cancer in 1979. Never knowing they were alive, Robert had died just 4 years later, still believing his entire family had perished. The children, now adults with families of their own, had grown up with manufactured histories, never suspecting their true origins until Wilson's investigation brought the terrible truth to light. What makes this case particularly disturbing, Wilson noted as he closed the file, it is that this wasn't just criminal corruption. It was a calculated dismantling of human lives, executed with bureaucratic precision. The 3 surviving members of the criminal network were now facing prosecution, though 2 had died decades earlier, taking their secrets to the grave. For the Martin children, now in their 60s, justice felt hollow compared to the lifetime of memories they had been robbed of, a family shattered not by choice or accident, but by the calculated cruelty of those who had sworn to serve and protect. As the story of the family's disappearance and shocking re-emergence spread across the nation, people struggled to process the truth. News programs interrupted regular broadcasting, newspapers printed special editions, and conversations in diners and living rooms centered on nothing else. How could an entire family vanish without a trace in 1962, only to be discovered living separate lives under different names 3 decades later? The revelation shattered the peaceful facade of several communities where the survivors had built new identities, leaving neighbors and colleagues stunned that they never suspected the truth hiding behind familiar faces. The investigation uncovered layers of deception so intricate that even seasoned detectives marveled at the family's ability to maintain their secret. Documents had been forged, records altered, and a network of silent accomplices had helped preserve their hidden existence. For 30 years, birthdays and holidays had passed with each family member believing the others were dead. A cruel but necessary fiction that had preserved their lives but hollowed them from within. Psychologists who worked with the survivors noted the profound trauma that lingered decades after that fateful night. The children, now middle-aged adults with children of their own, struggled to reconcile their fractured identities. How does one explain to a spouse or child that everything they knew about their past was carefully constructed fiction? The reunions, when they happened, were bittersweet. Strangers with shared blood and shared nightmares, trying to rebuild connections severed by necessity and time. Perhaps most haunting was the realization that their sacrifice had been necessary. The threat that scattered them to the winds had been real, the danger imminent. Even now, with the truth finally exposed, some family members refused public appearances, The instinct to hide too deeply ingrained to overcome. The scars of that night in 1962 remained etched in their psyches, a persistent reminder that survival sometimes demands the cruelest of choices. As one family member told a reporter before disappearing from public view once more, some secrets refuse to stay buried because they're the foundation we built our lives upon. Pull them out, and everything collapses. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from.